Ms Ryan, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for bringing a very important issue to debate with us today. And can I also pay my respects to organisations like Women's Aid that have raised so many of the issues that have been discussed today, and who have specifically raised the attitude of judicial attitudes. Now, I know that I know some of the difficulties that there are with judicial attitudes, because I did an Industry and Parliament Trust Fellowship in the law courts, where I spent, I think, almost 3 weeks with sitting with judges. And I would urge the Honourable Lady, if she has the time, to undertake an Industry and Parliament Trust Fellowship we're in the specific courts that are of interest to her, so that she can see how they work and can participate in how they work and how they can be changed to achieve some of the aims that I know that she holds absolutely dear. There's one aspect of this that I would like to bring up above all. And that is an aspect that comes from my membership of the Council of Europe. And that is something called the Istanbul Convention. Now, the Istanbul Convention is very important to this debate. And I see the Honourable Lady nodding, so she knows of the Istanbul Convention. And I want to mention it here because what it does is to set minimum standards for how the issue of domestic abuse, how the the minimum standards for how the issues of violence to women and to girls are to be treated in the member countries. And in doing that, the primary aim is to protect victims. And I think that that's a very important point to bear in mind. So the sort of stuff that it deals with is tackling domestic violence by ensuring that shelters, domestic violence shelters, are set up, that rape crisis shelters are set up, that helplines are available, and that counselling is available for victims to have access to. And it is I understand the reasons why the UK, although it has signed the Istanbul Convention, hasn't yet fully ratified it, because there are still elements of it that it needs to have a legal means of bringing into our own legislation. But I do think that as one of the countries that helped to produce the Istanbul Convention, that we move quickly to ratify it. Because if I can just read a very brief quote of what the Istanbul Convention itself has said. It says that no real equality between women and men will exist if women experience gender-based violence on a large scale and the state turns a blind eye. And I think that's a very important point to bear in mind, so that I hope that the Minister will take the Istanbul Convention into account in her response, because I do think it provides the necessary framework for people to be able to tackle this issue. The second way in which I would like to approach this is in my role as a member of the Justice Committee. And that may not seem immediately relevant to this, but the Justice Committee is a statutory consultee of the Sentencing Council. And we recently looked at draft sentencing guidelines on domestic abuse. Now, the previous guidelines for domestic abuse were, I'm afraid, last produced in 2006. They are completely out of date. They're out of date, particularly with society's attitudes to domestic abuse and to the standards that we want to see there. And I think the starting point for this is the definition of domestic abuse. And if I may quote again a little bit from this, what the guidelines say is that any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. The abuse can encompass, and this is the important point, it can encompass, but it's not limited to, psychological, physical, sexual, financial or emotional. And I think that that range of different abuses that it is listed there shows that there is a great attitude amongst the judiciary to change and to try to incorporate a much broader spectrum of activities within that. So what we said in our advice in our response to the Sentencing Council was that these need to be particularly serious offences. They don't just need to be ranked on a par with other offences. They need to be sorted out as really important offences. And overall, what we also said was that they needed to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. And if I can find it just in a second, I will read out what we actually said in one of the paragraphs in this report. Here we are. We recognise that recorded offences related to domestic abuse are largely, but not exclusively, perpetrated by men and boys against women and girls, and we understand the various contexts in which domestic abuse may occur and the forms that it takes. Accordingly, we recommend that comprehensive training on domestic abuse and intimidatory offences should be provided to magistrates and the judiciary to coincide with the launch of the guidelines. And I was very pleased to see that the judiciary has moved some way to do that and has begun the training that is required in order to make sure that people need that. So that need for training has been recognised. I'll happily give way.
I thank you for giving way. I had the most heartbreaking story a year ago from a Bath constituency about a Kafka's worker, which has already been mentioned. So the social worker allocated to the woman to help her through the process, and she felt that Kafka's worker is absolutely not sympathetic and seemed to have not had any of that training. Shouldn't that include also the social workers allocated to help women through the process? And also, shouldn't women have the right to pick the social worker working with them?
Well, I agree with her that the training can incorporate a large number of people, but we're dealing here with the courts and what we want to happen with the courts. And what I'm saying is that training, the need for training has been recognised in the courts. I think it is also important to ensure that domestic abuse cases are really flagged up properly as they pass through the court system, so that everyone knows what is a domestic abuse case and can help to smooth it along the way. And if I can turn to one other thing about these guidelines, they are overarching guidelines, and they recognise that a defining characteristic of domestic abuse is the harm that has been caused. And that harm goes to a violation of trust, which is a crucial element in this, and we should take into account that trust is actually a very important thing that we hold dear for this. Now, the third element that I wanted to touch on, just briefly, is the government's domestic violence consultation, which I think has just come out, or a couple of months ago. And it would be very useful if the Minister could provide some information about how that process is going and what the sort of questions are that will tackle the issues that we have raised today. Because I do think that these are very important issues. I don't have a vast array of case studies of my own to be able to give you. I have my experience of dealing with the courts. I have my experience, as the Honourable Lady does, of the Council of Europe and the Istanbul Convention. And I do urge the government to try to ratify the Istanbul Convention as quickly as possible.